Imagine trying to have an important conversation in a room packed from floor to ceiling, boxes everywhere, furniture stacked against the walls, papers covering every surface. There's barely enough space to walk. Now, imagine trying to think clearly in that room. You couldn't. And that's not because you lack intelligence, it's because there's no room. I think many of us live that way mentally. Our minds are crowded. Unfinished tasks, conversations we keep replaying, decisions we postpone, notifications, commitments, expectations, problems that haven't even happened yet. Then we wonder why we struggle to focus. The problem isn't usually our ability to think. It's that we were asking a crowded mind to produce clear thoughts. That's like asking someone to find one important document in a room full with clutter. The answer isn't to search harder, it's to clear the room. And that's where simplicity begins. That's where clarity finally has space to grow. Most people think mental clutter comes from having too much to do. And sometimes it does. But most often, it comes from carrying too much that no longer deserves your attention. Think about how many browser tabs you have open. Each one represents something unfinished. Now imagine your mind working the same way. A conversation you need to have, an email you haven't answered, a decision you've been avoiding, a promise that you made to yourself. And none of those thoughts are loud by themselves, but together they create this constant background noise. And that's why you can feel mentally exhausted before you've done any meaningful work. You're spending energy carrying things instead of moving them. Here's what I've learned. Your mind is an incredible place to create ideas. It's a terrible place to store everything. Every unfinished thought quietly asks for your attention. Every unnecessary commitment competes with what actually matters. Eventually, the important things become just another voice in the crowd. And that's why clarity isn't created by adding another productivity system. It's created by reducing competition. Imagine walking back into that crowded room and instead of trying to organize every single box, you begin removing the ones that never belong there. And then suddenly the room feels different. Not because you added something, but because you created space. And the same thing happens mentally. Every unnecessary obligation you release creates room for better thinking. Every distraction you remove makes your priorities easier to recognize. Every decision you make in advance eliminates dozens of decisions you no longer have to carry. I've discovered that peace often arrives the same way clarity does, not by gaining more, but by carrying less. And perhaps that's why simplicity feels so freeing. It doesn't give you a better brain, it gives your mind room to breathe. There's something else that creates mental clutter. Not unfinished tasks, but unfinished decisions. Every time you postpone a decision, your mind keeps it on the shelf. Should I do this? Should I keep this commitment? Should I finally let this go? And you may not be thinking about those questions every minute, but your mind never completely sets them down. They're always there, quietly occupying space. And I found that one clear decision creates more peace than weeks of indecision, even a difficult decision, because uncertainty has a way of multiplying itself. Clarity stops the multiplication. And that's why people who live intentionally often seem calmer. Not because life is easier for them, but because they've stopped carrying questions that they've already answered. And there's another source of clutter that's even harder to recognize. the need to keep everything, every opportunity, every invitation, every idea, every possibility. We convince ourselves that letting go means losing something valuable. But holding on to everything has a cost too. It costs attention, it costs energy, it costs presence. A crowded room doesn't become useful because you keep adding furniture. Eventually, the room stops serving you. Our minds work the same way. The purpose of your mind isn't to carry everything, it's to help you see clearly. And clarity requires space. That's why deliberate simplicity is so powerful. It asks a question our culture rarely asks. And it's not, what else can I do? It's more like, what no longer belongs here? That question changes everything. Because every unnecessary thought that you release creates room for an important one. Every unnecessary commitment that you remove strengthens the commitments that remain. Every unnecessary distraction that you eliminate makes your purpose easier to recognize. Clarity isn't hiding from you, it's often buried beneath things that never deserved your attention in the first place. So, what does clearing the room actually look like? It begins with one simple practice: stop carrying what belongs somewhere else. I'll say that again: stop carrying what belongs somewhere else. If a task needs to be done, write it down. If a decision needs to be made, schedule time to make it. If a conversation needs to happen, stop rehearsing it and have it. Every time you move something out of your mind and into action, your mind becomes a little quieter. Then ask yourself one question: does this deserve space in my mind? Not everything deserves equal access to your attention. Some thoughts are reminders, some are responsibilities, some are simply noise. Learning the difference is part of becoming intentional. I found another helpful practice. At the end of every day, don't just review what you accomplished. Review what you're still carrying. What conversation keeps replaying? What decision have you delayed? What obligation have you accepted that no longer reflects your priorities? Choose one, just one, and decide what you're going to do with it. Don't carry it into tomorrow if you don't have to. That's how clutter slowly but surely disappears. Not through one massive cleanup, but through one intentional removal at a time. That's today's daily focus. Identify one unnecessary commitment, task, or distraction that's occupying your mind, and if it doesn't deserve space there, remove it. Write it down, delegate it, complete it, or let it go. Because a clear mind isn't created by holding more. It's created by carrying only what deserves to be carried. And every time you make room for what matters, you make it easier to become the person you're trying to become. Think back to the image we've carried through this lesson: the crowded room. At the beginning, it felt impossible to imagine thinking clearly inside of it. There was simply too much competing for your attention. But notice something: we never changed the room by adding more. We changed it by creating space. Your mind works the same way. You don't need another app, another notebook, another productivity technique. You need enough space to hear what already matters. That's a quiet power of deliberate simplicity. It doesn't make life smaller. It makes what matters easier to see. So today, choose one thing to remove, not because it's bad, but because it no longer deserves space in your mind. One small act of clearing, one small act of intention, one little bit of breathing room. Because clarity rarely arrives all at once, it appears as the clutter disappears. And remember, a clear mind begins by making room for what matters. Now, one final thought before we move on. Notice what we didn't do today. We didn't try to organize every thought. We didn't create a color coded system. We didn't promise a life without responsibilities. We simply made room. And that's an important distinction because the goal isn't an empty mind. The goal is an available mind, a mind that's free to notice, free to think deeply, free to be fully present with the people in front of you, free to recognize opportunities instead of merely reacting to demands. That's the kind of mind clarity requires. As we continue through this phase, you'll notice a pattern. Each lesson isn't asking you to become someone new overnight. It's inviting you to remove one more obstacle standing between you and the person you're already capable of becoming. Sometimes growth comes from learning something new. Sometimes it comes from finally letting something go. This lesson is about letting go, not of your responsibilities, but of everything that's pretending to be one. So tomorrow morning, before you fill your mind, ask yourself a different question. What can I leave behind today? You may be surprised by how much lighter your thinking becomes and how much clearer your direction feels. Because a crowded room hides what matters. A clear room reveals it. The same is true of your mind. Imagine looking back a year from today, not after becoming a different person, but after becoming a lighter one. Not because life demanded less from you, but because you finally stopped carrying what never belonged to you in the first place. Think about how much energy you spent holding on to unfinished thoughts, imaginary conversations, obligation you've already outgrown, worries that never became reality. None of them made your life clearer. They simply made it heavier. That's the invitation of this lesson. Not to think harder, to carry less. Because clarity isn't something you chase, it's something that naturally appears when there's finally room for it. Think about the journey we've begun in this phase. First, you learn to begin with clarity. Now you've learned to protect that clarity by removing what competes with it. And those aren't separate practices, they're partners. One shows you what matters, the other removes what doesn't. That's how an intentional life is built. Not by constantly adding new systems, but by continually removing unnecessary complexity. That's why the principle of deliberate simplicity is so powerful. Complexity asks, what else do I need? Simplicity asks, what can I finally let go? And surprisingly, the question often produces the greater transformation. So, tomorrow, before your mind fills with everyone else's priorities, just clear one small space. Release one unnecessary burden. Let go of one distraction. Because every unnecessary thing you remove makes room for something that truly matters. One thought, one relationship, one purpose, one intentional next step. And remember, a clear mind doesn't come from carrying more. It comes from making room for what matters. Today's daily focus: identify one unnecessary commitment, task, thought, or distraction that's creating mental clutter. Remove it, complete it, delegate it, or let it go. Create one small space where clarity can grow. And here's a memorable principle: a clear mind begins by making room for what matters.